We're not starting at the temple. We're starting in a quarry, half a mile away from it, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. In 2014, a team from the German Archaeological Institute was digging through layers of packed soil near an already famous site. They weren't looking for anything new. They were measuring old stones, collecting pottery fragments, documenting chisel marks, routine fieldwork. And then their shovels hit something underneath the soil that wasn't supposed to be there. A single block of limestone, 64 feet long, 20 feet wide, 18 feet tall. One of its narrow sides had been polished smooth, as if someone had been preparing it for delivery. The team called it the Forgotten Stone. Its estimated weight, around 1,650 metric tons. That's heavier than 4 fully loaded Boeing 747s standing on a scale together. It's the largest worked stone in human history, and it never left the quarry. Somebody started cutting it and dressed one surface smooth, then walked away and never came back. Why? We'll get to that, but not yet. But here's what I can tell you now. By the end of this story, you'll know who carved this stone, where it was supposed to go, and why the answer forces you to rethink what ancient builders were actually capable of. Now let's go see the place where stones like this one were meant to end up. Half a mile northeast of the quarry, at the edge of the modern town of Baalbek, there's a wall. It's the western retaining wall of what was once the Temple of Jupiter, the largest Roman temple ever built outside of Rome. And set into that wall, about 23 feet off the ground, at the height of a 3-story building, sit 3 blocks of limestone. They're called the Trilithon. The name comes from Greek. Tri means 3, lithos means stone. Each block runs roughly 63 feet long, about the length of a bowling lane, 14 feet tall, 12 feet thick, and each one weighs somewhere between 750 and 800 metric tons. Those numbers are hard to picture. Let me try a few comparisons. A regular sedan, the kind you'd see in any parking lot, weighs about 2 tons. One Trilithon block weighs as much as 400 of those cars. 3 blocks together, that's 1,200 cars. Line them up bumper to bumper, and you'd stretch nearly 200 feet down the road. Or think of it differently. The Statue of Liberty, without her pedestal and concrete base, weighs about 225 tons total. Copper skin, steel skeleton, everything. You'd need roughly 3.5 statues, stripped down, to equal the weight of a single Trilithon block. Just one of the 3. And these blocks aren't resting on the ground. They sit 23 feet in the air. They were raised to the height of a 3rd-floor window and fitted against each other so tightly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. Without mortar, without cement, stone against stone, with a seam so fine it almost disappears. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, how would you do this? Today, in the 21st century, with every machine we have. The most powerful telescopic mobile crane on the planet right now is the Liebherr LTM 11200. Its telescopic boom reaches 100 meters into the sky. But its maximum lifting capacity, 1,200 metric tons, only works at minimum boom length, with the load sitting almost directly above the base. The moment you try to swing that load sideways, or reach the arm out even a few meters, the capacity drops, rapidly. One Trilithon block weighs 800 tons. It had to travel half a mile from the quarry. Then it had to be lifted to the height of a building. Then it had to be placed with the precision of a jeweler setting a stone into a ring. No standard construction crane in use anywhere on Earth today could do what was done at Baalbek. You would need a custom rig, months of engineering, computer models, structural simulations. Someone did it with rope, wood, and muscle, sometime around 2,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Nobody knows exactly when. And here is the part that makes the whole thing stranger. The Romans were obsessive record keepers. They documented the construction of the Colosseum in Rome, from the scheduling of gladiator games to the movement of 50,000 spectators through dozens of numbered gates. They left engineering notes on their aqueducts, page after page of gradients and water flow calculations. They wrote about quarrying obelisks in Egypt, shipping columns across the Mediterranean, building roads through mountain passes. Romans loved to talk about their construction projects. They bragged the way a proud homeowner walks you through a freshly renovated kitchen. Look at this, we built this. But about the Trilithon at Baalbek? Nothing. There's not a sentence, not a footnote, not a word in any surviving Roman text. The silence is total. It's as if these stones were already standing there when the Romans arrived, as if they found them, shrugged, and built their temple on top. So here we are, left with a question that has followed this place for centuries. How is it possible, without hydraulics, without steel, to move an 800-ton block of stone half a mile, raise it 23 feet into the air, and set it down with the accuracy of a few millimeters? Who did this, and when? And if the Romans, the greatest builders of the ancient world, didn't do it, and didn't even bother to write about whoever did, then what does that tell us about what we don't know? For most of recorded history, Baalbek was little more than a curiosity, a remote ruin in the mountains of Lebanon. Travelers passed through on their way to somewhere else, scribbled a few lines in their journals, and moved on. Nobody measured, nobody dug. The serious study of Baalbek began because of a single visit by a single man who happened to have the resources of an empire behind him. And the story of how we came to understand these stones starts, oddly enough, with a German emperor on a grand tour through the desert. November 1898. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would turn out to be the last emperor Germany ever had, is moving across the Middle East with the kind of caravan that stops traffic. He traveled with 100 carriages and 230 tents, guided by 10 men who knew the roads. Journalists trailed behind him. Local rulers arranged receptions, and the whole trip was part holiday, part diplomacy, and part advertisement for German power in a region where Germany badly wanted more influence. His last stop, before boarding a ship home from Beirut, was the ruins of Baalbek. He was there for a few hours, that's it. A walk through the columns, some photographs, an official lunch, and back to the coast. But something about that afternoon stayed with him. Within weeks of getting back to Berlin, he had arranged for the first German archaeological expedition to be sent to Lebanon. Think about what that means for a moment. Almost everything the world knows about Baalbek today can be traced back to one emperor spending one afternoon somewhere and deciding he couldn't stop thinking about it. The did began that same year and ran until 1904, 6 seasons of work. It was led by 2 men, Otto Puchstein and Theodore Wiegand, and both of them were architects by training. That detail matters more than it sounds. Architects measure, they draw plans, they record proportions, they care about how a wall was actually put together. Plenty of expeditions in that era went looking for statues and gold. This team spent 6 years documenting stone, and there was a lot to clear away. Baalbek had been lived in, fought over, and rebuilt for centuries after the Romans left. Byzantine builders had put churches inside the temples. Medieval rulers had turned the whole complex into a fortress, adding towers and walls and blocking doorways. The German team hauled out tons of rubble, peeling back those later layers to reach the ancient stone underneath. What came out of it was a 3-volume report published between 1921 and 1925. The title, in English, is simply Baalbek, Results of the Excavations. And more than a century later, it's still the foundation of serious scholarship on the site. Every researcher working at Baalbek today is, in some sense, still checking their findings against those volumes. But there's a shadow over that achievement, and it's worth understanding because it shaped what we think we know. The first problem was timing. The report should have appeared around 1914. Then the First World War arrived, and publication was pushed back by roughly 20 years. Otto Puchstein died in 1911. He never held the finished book in his hands. He spent years of his life measuring those stones and never saw the work printed. The second problem runs deeper. That team was looking for Rome. The Roman layer at Baalbek is spectacular. It was what European scholarship of the time valued most, and it was what the money had been raised to study. So the older material underneath, the Phoenician traces, the Persian traces, the much older strata, that is, the deeper layers of settlement, got far less attention. Some of it was cleared away to reach the Roman remains below. The result was a distortion that lasted decades. Baalbek got filed away as a purely Roman monument, full stop. And it took newer research, much later, to show that the real picture was considerably more tangled. So let's look at what that wall is actually made of. The podium of the Temple of Jupiter, the raised platform the whole building sits on, is not one solid mass of rock. It's built in courses, one on top of another, like a layer cake. The bottom row is made of blocks weighing around 350 tons each, roughly 36 feet wide. Now, 350 tons is already an absurd number. That's a block heavier than a fully loaded jumbo jet, sitting at the very base of the wall, where nobody was ever meant to look at it closely. Above that row sits a middle course of stone, and only on top of the middle course do you find the Trilithon. So the 3 most famous stones in the ancient world are the third layer of the cake, resting on 2 courses that are themselves colossal. 800 tons of limestone sitting on top of 350 tons of limestone, stacked without mortar and still holding after 2,000 years of earthquakes. On top of that platform stood the temple itself, ringed by a peristyle, that is, a row of columns running around the whole building. 54 columns of the Corinthian style, the ones with carved leaves at the top. Each stood about 66 feet tall, the height of a 6-story building. Those were the tallest columns anywhere in the classical world. Nothing in Athens, nothing in Rome itself came close. 6 of them are still standing. As for who ordered all this, we actually have a fairly good answer. and it isn't one person. Construction of the Temple of Jupiter seems to have begun under Augustus, around 16 years before our era. Nero added the enormous altar. Trajan, around the year 100, started work on the Great Court.
Antoninus Pius built the Temple of Bacchus next door. The Severan emperors finished things off with the Temple of Venus in the 3rd century. That's roughly 3 centuries of emperors adding to the same site, the way a medieval cathedral gets built by generations who never meet each other. Which brings us to the first thing archaeologists genuinely argue about. Who put the Trilithon in place? Mainstream archaeology gives the whole complex, Trilithon included, to the Romans. But some researchers have pointed at the lower courses of the podium and raised an uncomfortable objection. The Trilithon blocks show no trace of the Roman foot. The Roman foot was the standard unit of measurement across the empire. It shows up consistently in documented Roman construction, the way inches show up in American blueprints. Roman builders measured in Roman feet because that's what their tools, their plans, and their training used. Picture finding a skyscraper in downtown Manhattan built to no American standard measurement anywhere in its steel. No inches, no feet, nothing metric either, and no paperwork tying it to any known engineering firm. You'd have questions, probably a lot of them. And then there's a second argument, which sounds simpler but bothers engineers more. Why build with blocks this size at all? Blocks of 20 to 50 tons would have done exactly the same structural job. A wall doesn't care whether it's made of a few giant stones or many smaller ones, as long as it holds. Smaller blocks are easier to cut and move, and far less likely to ruin your entire project if one of them cracks along the way. So why choose the version that is harder by an order of magnitude? One idea is earthquakes. Massive blocks tend to ride out ground movement better than many small ones, and the Bekaa Valley shakes regularly. Another idea has nothing to do with engineering at all. It's a display, religious or political, meant to say something about power to anyone who came to worship. And a third explanation is much more practical. The limestone in this region splits along natural fracture lines, natural cracks between layers of rock. And in some cases, it was genuinely easier to cut out one enormous block along an existing crack than to carve dozens of tidy small ones. None of these has been proven. Historians and engineers still argue about it, and they argue in print. But the Trilithon is only the opening move. There's more sitting in that quarry, still half buried. And when archaeologists started digging deeper inside the temple itself, they found something nobody had expected to survive at all. Picture this. You're standing in a quarry half a mile southwest of the temple complex. White limestone under your feet, crumbling a little at the edges. In front of you, a slab of rock the size of a 5-story apartment building juts out of the ground at an angle. All around it you can see chisel marks, wedge grooves, the fine scratched lines where someone planned to cut. Somebody stood on this exact spot once and drew those lines, started cutting, and then left and never came back. This is the quarry that fed Baalbek. It sits slightly uphill from the temple complex on a gentle slope of about 1 degree. That matters. A 1-degree downhill gradient means that once you get a stone moving, gravity is working with you, not against you. The distance from the quarry to the temple platform is roughly 800 to 900 meters, a long walk, but not an impossible one. 3 unfinished stones have been found here,
and every one of them is bigger than the Trilithon blocks. The first is called Hajar al-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman.
It's about 67 feet long and 14 feet tall. Weight? Around 1,000 tons. It was cut free on 3 sides, but the 4th side was never separated from the bedrock beneath. The stone is still attached to the ground it was born from. In 2014, the German expedition figured out why. A fracture runs along one edge, a flaw in the rock, a natural crack that the builders could see and the engineers could measure. If they had tried to slide this block onto rollers and haul it downhill, there was a real chance it would split apart on the road. So they stopped, walked away from months of cutting, and started looking for a better stone. The second is called Hajar al-Qibli, the southern stone. It was found in the 1990s. It weighs roughly 1,242 tons, even bigger than the pregnant woman. And the third is the one we started this whole story with, the Forgotten Stone. 64 by 20 by 18 feet, 1,650 tons, with one narrow side polished smooth, ready for transport. It was sitting directly underneath the stone of the pregnant woman, hidden under layers of soil. It had been there for 20 centuries. Let me give you a sense of what moving stones like these would involve. In 1999, a team of engineers in the United States moved the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse on the coast of North Carolina 2,900 feet inland to save it from coastal erosion. The lighthouse weighed about 4,830 tons. That's heavier than any single stone at Baalbek. But the lighthouse was a whole building, moved on hydraulic jacks along steel track at a pace of a few feet per day by engineers with computers and decades of training. The move was treated as a major event in American engineering. Then there's the Thunderstone, the pedestal for the statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg, Russia. In 1768, Catherine the Great ordered a granite boulder weighing about 1,500 tons to be dragged roughly 4 miles overland to the Gulf of Finland and then shipped by water to the city. It took years, thousands of workers, and a system of custom-made metal channels lined with bronze balls, an early version of ball bearings. The press across Europe covered it as a once-in-a-generation spectacle. And that was one stone. Baalbek has dozens. How did the builders even know the quarry contained blocks of the right size? The measurements suggest that the podium was never finished. Roughly 10 blocks are missing from the top course. If the plan called for around 14 blocks of 1,500 or more tons each, then the builders had figured out, before they began, that the quarry's limestone beds ran deep enough and clean enough to yield blocks of a specific thickness. Today we'd call that a geological survey. We'd use core drills, ground-penetrating radar, laboratory analysis of rock samples. How they did it with mallets and chisels, we don't know. Now, the locals have their own explanations, and they've had them for a long time. One story says the stone is named after a pregnant woman who promised the people of Baalbek that she'd reveal the secret of moving the block if they fed her until she gave birth. Whether she ever delivered the secret, the story doesn't say. Another legend says pregnant jinn, that is, spirits from Arabic folklore, carved and carried the stones, and that touching the stone to this day can help a woman get pregnant. These are folk tales, but they prove something real. The mystery of these stones has eaten at people for thousands of years. Every generation that lived near the quarry came up with a story to explain what they saw.
and not one of those stories involved ordinary human labor. The stones were too big for that kind of explanation to feel satisfying. The quarry is where the stones were born, but to understand where they were going, you need to stand on the platform itself and look up. Imagine you're on the podium of the Temple of Jupiter. 6 enormous Corinthian columns, the ones with the carved stone leaves, rise 66 feet above you.
Each one is made of 3 drums of stone stacked on top of each other, and even the uppermost block of the entablature, the decorative band running across the top of the columns, weighs around 100 tons. The wind moves between them, and all around you, empty pedestals from the other 48 columns that once stood here and are now gone. This was the largest Roman temple ever built outside of Rome. The building stretched 290 feet long and 160 feet wide, with 10 columns across the front and 19 down each side. For comparison, the columns of the Parthenon in Athens stand 34 feet. These stand 66, nearly twice the height. And the Temple of Bacchus next door, the one usually described as the smaller temple at Baalbek, is actually larger than the Parthenon. The smaller building at Baalbek is bigger than the most famous temple in Greece. And the columns weren't local stone. They were rose granite, quarried at Aswan in Egypt. Some sources say a type of rock called syenite, found only in that region. They were shipped across the Mediterranean by sea, then hauled overland through the mountains of Lebanon, and finally hoisted onto the 23-foot podium on top of the megalithic foundation. Every single one of them. So what happened to this place? In 524 or 525, a lightning strike destroyed the temple. Later, Emperor Justinian ordered 8 of the granite columns pulled down and shipped to Constantinople, supposedly for the construction of the Hagia Sophia. In 1759, an earthquake toppled 3 more. The 6 that still stand have been there, exposed to weather and war, for roughly 1,500 years. And there's one more detail, a strange one. Mark Twain visited Baalbek in 1867 during the trip through the Holy Land that he later wrote up in The Innocents Abroad. It was the best-selling book of his lifetime. About the substructures beneath the temple, Twain wrote that they were crossed by tunnels of masonry wide enough for a train of rail cars to pass through. Who dug those tunnels inside the podium, and why? Nobody is sure. Scholars have debated it, but no answer has held. 6 columns. That's all that's left of the biggest Roman temple in the world. But the most interesting part of Baalbek isn't above ground. It's underneath. And when the archaeologists finally dug past the Roman floor and went deeper, what they found there changed the story of the site entirely. If you're finding this interesting, a like really helps this kind of content reach more people. And if you'd like to keep exploring stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. Here's a question for you. If you had to move an 800-ton block of stone half a mile using only the tools available 2,000 years ago, what would your plan be? Drop your answer in the comments. Imagine you're an archaeologist. You've spent weeks in Baalbek, standing at the western wall of the podium, photographing every course of stone, measuring joints, recording how each block sits against the next. You know this wall the way a mechanic knows an engine. Then you fly to Jerusalem. You walk up to the western wall, the ancient retaining wall of the Temple Mount, and you see the same masonry, same proportions, same pattern, same block dimensions. 2 walls, 200 miles apart, in 2 different countries,
looking like they were built by the same crew. In 2011, two German researchers named Andreas Kropp and Daniel Lohmann published the results of the first detailed architectural survey of something they called Podium 1. This was an earlier, inner phase of the Temple of Jupiter podium, hidden beneath the 6 columns that are still standing. Most visitors walk right past it. The German team of 1900 hadn't paid much attention to it either. But Kropp and Lohmann measured it carefully, and what they found changed the conversation about Baalbek.
The masonry technique of Podium 1 was a near-perfect match for Herodian construction in Jerusalem.
Let me explain what that means in plain language. When a stonemason builds a wall, the way the blocks are arranged follows a pattern. At both Baalbek and the Temple Mount, the researchers found the same alternating pattern. One block laid lengthwise, the next turned sideways, then lengthwise again. This is called a header and stretcher bond. On its own, that's a common enough technique. Lots of builders in the ancient world used it. But there was more. The edges of the blocks at both sites had been finished in exactly the same way. Each block had a flat, chiseled border running around its face, with the center left rough and raised. This is called drafted margin masonry. And the average height of each course, that is, each horizontal row of blocks in the wall, measured 1.11 meters at both locations. Just over a meter and 10 centimeters. The same in Baalbek and in Jerusalem. That number is too precise to be a coincidence. Kropp and Lohmann proposed that Herodian builders, the same teams, or at least the same tradition of stonemasons, had worked at both sites. Either the same craftsmen traveled from Jerusalem to Baalbek, or both projects drew from a shared school of engineering that used identical standards. So who was Herod? Herod the Great ruled Judea from roughly 37 to 4 years before our era. He was, by any measure, the most ambitious builder of his time. He rebuilt the Second Temple in Jerusalem, turning it into one of the wonders of the ancient world. The fortress of Masada, perched on a desert cliff, was his work too, and so was the port of Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast, with an artificial harbor that was an engineering achievement by itself. He was also known for bankrolling, that is, paying for, construction projects on Roman territory well beyond his own borders, spending money on buildings in cities he didn't rule. It was political investment. You spend on someone else's temple, and they remember your name.
The heaviest known Herodian block in Jerusalem measures 45 by 10.5 by 14 feet. Its weight, roughly 570 tons. That's enormous. But it's still lighter than a Trilithon block. And this is where the puzzle tightens. If Herodian craftsmen built Podium 1, the inner, older phase of the platform, then who built Podium 2, the outer, larger structure that holds the Trilithon? Kropp and Lohmann suggest that Roman architects came along later and expanded the existing Herodian platform, using it as a ready-made retaining wall and building outward from it. Other researchers, including the archaeoastronomer Giulio Magli, argue that the Herodian project was bigger than Kropp and Lohmann think, and that both podiums belong to the same original plan. The debate is still open, and what makes it difficult to settle is that the evidence sits in two countries with very different political realities, which makes coordinated fieldwork complicated. Now, here's something the early German team found more than 100 years ago, and it still hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. During the excavations of 1900 to 1904,
Workers clearing the great court swept away centuries of packed dust and debris. And carved into the stone floor, they found an architectural drawing, a detailed plan of the pediment of the Temple of Jupiter, the triangular section above the columns, cut right into the paving at a scale of roughly 1 to 12.6. This wasn't a rough sketch. This was a working document, a construction blueprint, scored into stone so it would survive weather, fire, and time. The architects were planning to come back and check their measurements. They wanted something that wouldn't rot or blow away. A second drawing turned up on the upper surface of one of the Trilithon blocks. It covers the entire top face of the stone, and parts of it are hidden by the blocks that were placed on top of it afterward. Follow the logic.
The blocks sitting on top of the Trilithon were laid down during the construction of the Temple of Jupiter. The drawing on the Trilithon was made before those blocks were placed, which means the Trilithon was already in position before the temple went up. The foundation came first. The temple was built on top of it. And then there's a Greek inscription found on one of the Jupiter columns on the uppermost drum. It contains a date that corresponds to roughly 60 years after our era. If that inscription was carved while the column was being assembled, it pins down at least part of the construction to a specific moment in time. But the real question is the gap. If the Trilithon was already standing when the temple builders arrived with their plans and their Greek inscriptions, how much older is the Trilithon? Are we talking about a few decades or 1,000 years? The stones don't answer that. The drawings on them tell us the sequence. First the foundation, then the temple. But they don't tell us the distance between the two. Was the drawing on the Trilithon a working schematic? Something the architects carved to guide the masons? Or was it more like a signature, a way of saying, I was here, and this is what I designed? We don't know. What we do know is that this site has far more layers than anyone imagined when that first German team started digging. When later archaeologists went deeper, past the Roman floors and the Hellenistic fill, past everything that looked familiar, they found that Baalbek was never a Roman city built from nothing. People had been living on this hill for 11,000 years, and every civilization that passed through, from the Stone Age onward, treated this spot as sacred ground. When archaeologists dug beneath the floor of the Temple of Jupiter, they expected to find Roman construction all the way down. Foundations, fill, maybe some Greek pottery. What they found instead was much older. The layers kept going. Below the Roman stonework, there was Hellenistic rubble. Deeper still, Persian ceramics and Phoenician traces. And below all of it, deep in the earth, fragments of Neolithic settlement, tools, hearths, bits of pottery from a time before agriculture had fully taken hold in this part of the world. The evidence points to people living on this hilltop as far back as roughly 9,000 years before our era. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramid at Giza was built around 2,500 years before our era. The first settlers at Baalbek were here 5,000 years before the pyramids. They chose the highest point on the hill, and then, for the next 11,000 years, every civilization that arrived on this spot did the same thing. They built on top of what was already there. The first people we can name are the Phoenicians. The word Baalbek itself comes from the Phoenician Baalbeka, meaning Lord of the Bekaa Valley. There's an alternate explanation too. Baal of the Spring, named after a natural water source near the site. Water in a dry region would have made this place worth fighting over long before anyone built a temple.
Around 3,200 years before our era, the Phoenicians are believed to have raised a temple complex here dedicated to Baal, the sky god, and Astarte, the goddess of love and motherhood. Baalbek became a pilgrimage site. People traveled here from across the Near East, the way medieval Europeans traveled to Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela. Traces of that Phoenician temple have been found underneath the foundations of the Roman temple of Jupiter. The Romans didn't start from bare ground. They built on top of something that was already sacred. And here is where a number of researchers make a claim that, if true, rewrites the timeline entirely. They argue that the megalithic blocks of the Trilithon and the Western Wall belong to the Phoenician period, not the Roman one. If they're right, those 800-ton blocks were cut, moved, and placed roughly 5,000 years ago. That would make the Trilithon older than Stonehenge. It's a hypothesis, not a settled fact. But nobody has been able to rule it out. After the Phoenicians came the Persians. In 2004, a joint expedition from the Lebanese University and the German Archaeological Institute made a find in the quarry that nobody had expected. Fragments of Persian ceramics turned up, some of them carrying cuneiform inscriptions, that is, the wedge-shaped writing system used across the Persian Empire. The fragments were dated to the 6th through 4th centuries before our era. So the Persians were here, in the quarry, centuries before Rome arrived. But does that make them the builders of the megaliths? The Persian Empire was certainly capable of massive construction. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian kings, is proof of that. But the blocks at Persepolis weigh between 1 and 20 tons. The Trilithon blocks weigh 800. That's a gap of 40 to 800 times. And just like the Romans, the Persians left no written record claiming they had built anything megalithic at Baalbek. They were here. They left pottery in the quarry, but they didn't leave an explanation. After Alexander renamed the city Heliopolis, the city of the sun, in the 330s before our era, Greek columns and inscriptions filtered in over the next 2 centuries as the site passed from the Ptolemies of Egypt to the Seleucids of Syria. Pompeii brought the region under Roman control in 64 before our era. Julius Caesar followed 17 years later with a Roman colony. And then Augustus, around 16 before our era, launched the building program that would eventually produce the Temple of Jupiter. What's interesting is what the Romans chose not to do. They didn't tear everything down and start from scratch. They looked at the local god, Baal, and they looked at their own chief god, Jupiter, and they merged the two into a hybrid deity called Jupiter-Baal. The old pilgrims could keep coming. The new Roman colonists could worship in their own tradition. Everyone used the same temple. It was diplomacy expressed in stone. Construction stretched across 3 centuries, emperor after emperor adding courtyards, altars, and smaller temples to the complex. At its peak, the site had 54 towering columns, marble surfaces catching the sun, and thousands of pilgrims filling the courtyards on festival days. Imagine something on the scale of the National Mall in Washington, but built with hand tools over 300 years in a province thousands of miles from the capital and layered on top of someone else's foundation. Then the world changed. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Construction at Baalbek stopped. His successor, Theodosius I, ordered the pagan statues destroyed. The temple spaces were stripped of their gods and turned into churches. The Temple of Venus, the last building the Romans had added to the complex,
became a Christian chapel. Justinian shipped columns to Constantinople. In 637, Muslim armies took Baalbek. The temples were converted into a fortress known in Arabic as Qalat Baalbek. After that, dynasty followed dynasty. Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, Ayyubids, each one rebuilding the fortress walls, adding towers, patching what the earthquakes had broken. The complex kept changing hands, but it never stopped being used. And this is the thing that should bother you if you think about it long enough. 11,000 years. From nameless Neolithic settlers to Phoenician priests, to Persian soldiers, to Greek colonists, to Roman engineers, to Christian bishops, to Muslim commanders. Every one of them treated this hilltop as special, built on top of what the previous people had left behind. And in all those centuries and all those languages, not a single one of them wrote down who placed the megalithic stones at the base of the wall. In 1984, UNESCO inscribed Baalbek as a World Heritage Site. The honor recognized what everyone already knew. This place is extraordinary. But the inscription didn't settle the basic question. After 11,000 years of continuous habitation, there is still no document, no inscription, no scrap of text anywhere explaining how the Trilithon blocks were cut, moved, and set in place. Everyone came, everyone marveled, everyone built on top. But nobody explained how it started. Maybe the answer isn't in the history at all. Maybe it's in the physics. All right, we've seen the stones and walked through the history. Now comes the engineering question. How do you actually move an 800-ton block of limestone half a mile, lift it 23 feet off the ground, and set it in place with the precision of a few millimeters? People have been trying to answer that for a long time. Let's go through what they've come up with. The first idea is the most obvious one: rollers. You put the block on a set of cylindrical logs, you attach ropes, and you pull. It's how most people picture ancient construction when they close their eyes and try to imagine it. In the 1960s, the British archaeologist Richard Atkinson decided to test this. He made a replica of a Stonehenge bluestone, which weighs only a few tons, and tried to move it on wooden rollers. On flat ground, it worked, more or less. But the moment the surface tilted even slightly, the stone started sliding sideways. It couldn't be steered. In a related experiment, a replica is said to have lost balance and broken apart. And those tests were done with blocks of a few tons. The Trilithon weighs 800. Here's the basic physics problem. Pressure is force divided by area. 800 tons pressing down on a row of wooden logs would produce so much force per square inch that the timber would almost certainly crush flat, the way a car tire would flatten a breadstick. No one has ever tested rollers under anything close to this weight. We don't know for certain that it can't work, but no experiment supports the idea that it can. The second theory is Roman cranes. The Romans were outstanding engineers, and they built some genuinely clever lifting machines. Their simplest crane, the trispastos, used 3 pulleys and let a single man lift about 150 kilograms, roughly 330 pounds. The pentaspastos had 5 pulleys and could manage around 250 kilograms, about 550 pounds. Their most powerful known device, the polyspastos, used a system of pulleys and multiple masts. With 4 men working the winch, it could lift about 3 tons. Add a tread wheel, which is essentially a human-powered hamster wheel, and the capacity went up to about 6.5 tons.
6.5 tons. That's the ceiling for the most powerful Roman lifting system we have any record of. A Trilithon block weighs more than 120 times that. There is no known Roman crane that comes anywhere near 800 tons. Could they have combined many cranes working together? In theory, yes. But the coordination problem is severe. If 60 cranes need to lift in perfect unison and one of them slips, the entire load shifts and the block can crack or fall. It's the kind of operation that today would require computer-controlled hydraulics. Doing it by hand, with shouted commands and hemp rope, is difficult to picture. The third theory comes from a French archaeologist named Jean-Pierre Adam, who published his calculations in 1977. Adam built the most detailed model anyone had produced up to that point. He proposed a system of around 40 capstans, large vertical drums turned by teams of workers pulling on horizontal bars, combined with pulleys and rollers. According to his math, roughly 512 workers operating this system could move a block of 557 tons along a flat, well-built Roman road. That's an impressive number. But 557 tons is about 70% of a Trilithon block's weight. The remaining 30% is the difference between theory and reality. And Adam's model doesn't account for the vertical lift. Getting the stone to the wall is one problem. Raising it 23 feet to the third course of the podium is a different problem entirely. Other engineers have gone further with their estimates. Some calculations suggest that moving an 800-ton block over rough terrain and raising it to the height of a 3-story building would require up to 40,000 workers. 40,000 people. That's more than the population of most ancient cities. You'd need to feed them, house them, and coordinate them. The logistics alone would be a feat of engineering. A fourth idea tries to skip the transportation problem altogether. What if the stones were never moved at all? What if they were carved from bedrock right where the temple stands, shaped in place without ever leaving the ground? It's a creative proposal, but it runs straight into geology. When researchers compared the limestone of the podium blocks to rock samples from the quarry 800 meters away, they matched. The same stone, the same chemical composition, the same layer of limestone. The bedrock directly under the temple is different stone. The blocks came from the quarry. They were moved. But there's one discovery that does help explain part of the puzzle. German researcher Margaretha van S. of the German Archaeological Institute found that the builders used a specific cutting method. They extracted their megaliths along natural fracture planes, the horizontal cracks that form naturally between layers of limestone. By following these existing breaks in the rock, the quarry workers could remove enormous blocks without risking uncontrolled splits that might ruin months of work. The same method has been found at the Roman aqueduct of Pont du Gard in France, which confirms it was part of the Roman engineering toolkit. So we know how they cut the stones. We still don't fully know how they moved them. There is one reason not to give up entirely. We know it's possible to move a stone weighing over 1,000 tons because it's been done. The Thunderstone in St. Petersburg, about 1,500 tons, was moved roughly 4 miles overland in 1768. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, nearly 5,000 tons, was moved in 1999. Both required enormous resources, years of planning, and national-level commitment. And both were single objects. Baalbek's builders did something comparable with dozens of blocks, using rope and muscle and wood. After centuries of research, after countless experiments and heated arguments between archaeologists and engineers, the honest answer is this: no single theory fully explains how the Trilithon blocks were moved, lifted, and set with such precision. The best we can say is that our knowledge of Roman technology and historical examples of moving massive stones suggests it could have been done. But it would have required coordination, effort, and time on a scale that's hard to imagine even today. The facts are on the table, and every theory has been tested against them. But there's one more question about Baalbek that gets asked more often than any other, and it's the one that makes professional archaeologists sigh. What if it wasn't humans at all? When you can't explain something, you tell a story about it. And people have been telling stories about Baalbek for a very long time. The oldest explanations are religious. One tradition says Baalbek was built by Cain, the first son of Adam, wandering the earth under a divine curse. In this telling, the stones are the work of a man cast out by God, building something enormous to prove he still mattered. Another tradition credits King Nimrod, the legendary ruler who appears in several ancient texts and who is also linked to the Tower of Babel. According to this version, Nimrod rebuilt Baalbek after the Great Flood with the help of the Titans. Some accounts bring in the Nephilim too, mysterious giant beings mentioned in old Hebrew writings. Why giants? Because when you stand next to a Trilithon block, a person looks like an ant standing next to a brick. It's psychologically very natural to look at something that large and conclude that whoever built it must have been superhuman. The scale doesn't seem to match ordinary human bodies, so you invent bigger bodies. But here's what the stones themselves say. The tool marks on the Trilithon blocks match standard ancient tools: chisels, picks, and bush hammers. The grooves are consistent with arms swinging at normal human height. The wedge holes are spaced for workers standing shoulder to shoulder. Whoever cut these stones was the same size as you and me. The legends are beautiful. They tell you a lot about how the mystery affected the people who lived near it. But as explanations, they don't hold up against the physical evidence. In the 20th century, a different kind of story emerged. Writers like Graham Hancock and Zechariah Sitchin proposed that Baalbek was built by a lost civilization, a culture that existed before recorded history and possessed engineering knowledge that was later destroyed, perhaps by a catastrophic flood. This idea has sold millions of books and generated enormous public interest. The argument in its favor has a certain logic. The structure exists. Nobody has found a document claiming credit for it. The scale of the megaliths goes beyond anything that's been documented for Rome, Persia, or any other known civilization. So maybe, the reasoning goes, there was a civilization we haven't discovered yet, one that knew things we've forgotten. The argument against it is simpler, but harder to get around. If a civilization with advanced engineering once existed, where is everything else it would have left behind? Where are the tools, the workshops, the roads, the harbors, the supply chains that a society capable of cutting 1,600-ton blocks would need? At Baalbek, the only technology found in the quarry and the podium is exactly what you'd expect from the ancient world: chisels, wedges, levers, rollers. The marks on the stones are consistent with manual labor using implements that fit in a human hand. This is the same logical problem that follows every lost civilization claim. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas, which some writers said was a submerged highway from Atlantis, turned out to be a natural formation of beach rock. The Kensington Runestone in Minnesota, supposedly carved by Viking explorers centuries before Columbus, is now widely considered a 19th century forgery. In each case, the extraordinary claim exists. The extraordinary evidence doesn't. What does exist at Baalbek is evidence of extraordinary determination by people using ordinary tools. Then there's the version that gets the most attention online. The ancient aliens theory proposes that only beings with technology far beyond human capability could have moved stones of this weight. The absence of written records is taken as proof on the grounds that human civilizations would have bragged about such a feat. And since nobody bragged, the builders must not have been human. The philosopher Daniel Dennett once made an observation that fits here. He said that when people can't imagine how something was actually done, they reach for the supernatural. We fill the gap in our imagination with gods, giants, or visitors from space. But the gap isn't in reality, it's in us. We know that the Thunderstone, about 1,500 tons, was moved by human beings in the 18th century. We know that Egyptian engineers transported obelisks weighing over 300 tons across thousands of miles of desert and river. We know that Herodian builders in Jerusalem placed blocks of 570 tons into the Western Wall. Baalbek is an extreme case. The blocks are bigger, the tolerances are tighter, the logistics are harder. But it sits on the far end of a scale that includes many other human achievements, not in a category by itself. Two smaller theories deserve a mention because they come up often enough. The first is the concrete theory. Some people have suggested that the Trilithon blocks weren't quarried at all, that they were poured from a kind of ancient concrete and allowed to harden in place. The problem is straightforward. The blocks are solid limestone, and their chemical composition matches the quarry rock 800 meters away. Limestone is a natural stone, not a poured material. And if you were going to pour something, you'd do it at the building site, not at a quarry half a mile away and then drag it uphill. The second is the idea that gravity was different in the past, that the physical force pulling objects toward the earth was somehow weaker thousands of years ago, making heavy stones easier to lift. This contradicts everything known in physics and astronomy. The gravitational constant hasn't changed on any time scale that matters to human history. We're talking about stability measured in millions of years, not a few thousand. So all of these alternative theories fail on the evidence. Why do they keep coming back? Because they ask the right question. The value of these ideas, even when they're wrong, is that they force a response. They push archaeologists to explain their answers in more detail. They don't let the academic world get away with saying, "The Romans did it," without explaining how, step by step, block by block. They drive public interest in a site that might otherwise be known only to specialists, and they keep the conversation alive. Baalbek is a blank canvas. The absence of written records creates a vacuum, and everyone who looks at these stones projects something different onto them. Lost civilizations, visitors from other worlds, engineering geniuses, or just very stubborn, very determined human beings with chisels and rope and an idea that wouldn't let them rest. Vacuums fill with stories, and they always have. The question is whether the real story, the one the evidence supports, is any less astonishing than the myths. And I don't think it is. It's time to go back to where we started, back to the quarry, back to the stone that nobody finished. And this time, we're going to finish the story ourselves.
Back to the quarry. It's 2014, and a team from the German Archaeological Institute arrives at Baalbek, led by Professor Janine Abdul-Masih of the Lebanese University and Margarita van S. Their goal is modest, at least by the standards of what they're about to find. They want to study cutting techniques. They plan to document tool marks on the stone of the pregnant woman, sift through the debris piles around it, and look for pottery fragments that might be dated. Routine fieldwork, a data-gathering trip. They start digging around the base of the pregnant woman, clearing soil that hasn't been moved in centuries. And then, underneath it, they find another stone. It was a monolith, a single enormous block, cut free from the bedrock on all reachable sides. 64 feet long, 20 feet wide, 18 feet tall. One narrow side already polished smooth, the way you'd prepare a surface that's meant to be seen. Weight, around 1,650 metric tons. The largest worked stone in human history, lying directly beneath the second largest one, buried under layers of soil and time. The excavation had to stop. The trench around the stone had grown so deep that the walls risked collapsing in on the workers. They photographed what they could, measured what they could reach, and climbed out. But the measurements told a story. When you compare the dimensions of the forgotten stone to the unfinished sections of the Temple of Jupiter podium, a picture comes together. The podium was never completed. The top course of the western wall is missing roughly 10 blocks. If you work out the sizes those blocks would need to be, based on the proportions of the existing wall, they match the stones in the quarry. The stone of the pregnant woman at 1,000 tons, the southern stone at 1,242 tons, the forgotten stone at 1,650 tons. These aren't random practice pieces. They aren't blocks that someone cut for fun. They're parts of an unfinished project. If the podium had been completed as planned, the top row of the wall would have held around 14 blocks, each weighing 1,500 tons or more. A Roman-style podium built to Roman engineering standards, but at a scale that nobody has matched before or since. And here's the detail that turns the whole story on its head. The stone of the pregnant woman wasn't abandoned because the builders couldn't move it. It was abandoned because they found a crack. A fracture runs along one edge of the stone, a natural flaw in the limestone. If the workers had tried to separate it from the bedrock and drag it downhill, that crack could have split the block apart. They'd have lost months of labor, maybe years. So they made a decision. They left the flawed stone where it was and started cutting a new one directly underneath it, a bigger one, the forgotten stone. Let that sink in. These weren't people who gave up when things went wrong. They looked at a 1,000-ton block with a crack in it and said, "Fine, we'll cut a bigger one." That's not a story about failure or lost knowledge. That's a story about confidence, about a plan that was clear enough and an ambition large enough that a cracked stone was a setback, not a catastrophe. At the very beginning of this story, we asked a question. Who carved the largest worked stone in history, and why did they leave it in the ground? The most likely answer, based on the masonry evidence, the architectural drawings, the pottery, and the Greek inscriptions, builders of the Roman or Herodian period, working sometime in the 1st century before our era,
or the 1st century after. They were following an exact plan, the same plan that was carved into the stone floor of the Great Court and onto the surface of the Trilithon itself. They didn't quit because they couldn't do the work. They hit a defect in the rock, started over, and then, at some point, stopped for good. Why they stopped, we can only guess. Funding ran out, or wars pulled resources to other places. A new emperor may have had different priorities, or maybe someone finally looked at the numbers and realized the project had outgrown the empire's ability to pay for it. The ambition was real, and so was the plan. The money, eventually, was not. So what do we make of all this? Baalbek is 11,000 years of people refusing to leave a hilltop alone. Every group that arrived, from the nameless settlers of the Stone Age to Phoenician priests, Persian administrators, Greek colonists, Roman engineers, Christian bishops, and Muslim commanders, looked at the same hill and decided it was worth building on. They stacked their temples and their fortresses on top of whatever the last people had left. And in all that time, across all those languages and religions, not one civilization claimed to have laid the megalithic foundation. We live in a time of three-dimensional printing, robotics, and computer-guided construction. Engineers today can model stresses on a screen before they pour a single foundation. Cranes are guided by satellite. Concrete is mixed to exact chemical formulas. And we still can't fully explain how people 2,000 years ago, working without electricity, steel, or computers, moved stones that our best equipment would struggle to lift today. That isn't a reason for conspiracy theories about aliens or lost civilizations. It's a reason for respect. We're used to thinking of the past as simple, as primitive, as something we've moved beyond. Baalbek won't let you think that way. The people who cut and moved these stones were not less intelligent than we are. They had different tools. They had the same ingenuity. And they had something else, something harder to name. A willingness to attempt things that made no practical sense, and to keep attempting them across generations, passing the work from one century to the next. Why? Why spend years, thousands of lives, unimaginable resources to place an 800-ton block at the height of a 3-story building when 50 blocks of 16 tons each would have done the job exactly as well? What makes people do the impossible when there's an easier way? Maybe the answer isn't in the stones. Maybe it's in us. Maybe the urge to build something that shouldn't exist, something that makes the next generation stop and stare and ask how, is the thing that makes us human. The stone is still in the quarry, one side polished, the rest still buried. Nobody has come back to finish it. But nobody has forgotten it either. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, a like and a subscription would mean a lot. Here's one last question to think about. Why do you think the builders chose to cut stones weighing over 1,000 tons when much smaller blocks would have done the same job? Was it religion, politics, engineering pride, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments.